Well, kind of wish Bulgarian fights are staffing Tronul Gran, after Solum, Brother Kintagan, Churis Tassan O'Gree. We're very pleased to begin the series of lectures with a visit from our old friend Pádraig Macháin. He doesn't need an introduction. I won't give him a good one, but I'll try. He's a former inmate of the Dublin Institute at the School of Catholic Studies. He's a professor here for many years. He was instrumental as a founder and promoter of ISAS for many years. This wonderful resource for putting manuscripts online. He's worked extensively on late medieval Irish and early modern Irish, on text and textual editions, and also has a deep interest in the materiality of manuscripts, what they're made of, and how they came into being. A number of years ago, he departed the Institute when he was appointed Professor of Modern Irish at University College Cork, and he's got the reputation of being a very dynamic and very forward-looking professor of modern Irish there. Some years ago, he was awarded an IRC grant, I believe, to look at this subject, which was of great interest, the makeup, the materiality of manuscripts, hence the name, the Inks and Skins Project, Exploring Irish Manuscripts. And for this, he assembled a team, an international team of experts who are here with him today. So Pádraig will start and he will introduce each of the speakers as we go on. So Pádraig Macháin and the Inks and Skins Project.
Made it sound like a rock and roll band. Project awesome an cuireáid an scoil an teachtal láithir an cuireadh láithir. As Rory said, this project is funded by the Irish Research Council under the Advanced Laureate scheme, and it's been in existence since 2019 and due to end next year. The project has its origins in a number of aspects of my own work, interests of my own. Since I was first appointed here in the School of Catholic Studies nearly 40 years ago, I have been in contact with manuscripts from a range of areas, initially through my work with the late Hay in the National Library of Ireland, and then working with Professor Pádraig on a number of projects here, leading to the establishment of Irish Script on Screen, which was launched in 1999. And it's fair to say that the questions we're asking in this project today were the ones that were forming themselves way back when confronted with an almost unrestricted access to Ireland's manuscript heritage. Cataloguing manuscripts may sound like a mundane mechanical activity, but in fact it's a gateway to so much knowledge, of course, but also so many questions. The listing of the primary contents in any given manuscript is often the least complicated part of it. It's in the analysis of the finer points, the separation of hands, recording the marginalia, notes and jottings, collation, pagination, foliation, binding, ruling, and so forth. It's that work that some might regard as tedious, applied systematically to all manuscripts, big and small, no matter what their date, that you begin to get an understanding of the subtextual aspects of the book that in turn lead you to appreciate the manuscript not just as a collection of texts, but as an artifact in itself. Such a book may have leaves or quires missing, it may be torn and ragged, unbound in many cases, but as it survives today, paradoxically, it is whole and complete in the sense that what you have before you is the sum of everything the book has been through since the time it was constructed. So that there's a narrative at play that has not traditionally come, if you like, within the philologist's remit, for the very good reason that in our work, the text has always been to the forefront, and that's as it should be. In the work of textual editing and analysis, we tend to relegate of necessity the material elements of a given manuscript or a given leaf or a quire in a manuscript to a subsidiary position. questions of staining or tearing or abrasion, for example. And yet, staining patterns, for instance, are as much as old foliations, which often are cropped away in any case, can be of great help in deciding to decide the order of quires and the way the book might have existed before it entered the library. Apart from how an examination of the materiality of manuscripts can help our editorial work, there is a case to be made for such a study as an end in itself. The more we seek the answers to ostensibly simple questions, like what is the writing support in this book, what kind of ink or pigment is this, and the more we seek scientific proof, which is the important thing, scientific proof of what we have, what we've always assumed and thought we knew, the closer we get to the time, in the case of parchment manuscripts, when the skin was prepared, when the page was written on, or the letter was rubricated and decorated, and in that way I think we come closer to describe himself. So the digital revolution of the last 20 years has been one of the most significant, I suppose, since the Industrial Revolution. In the case of Irish script on screen, it meant that after the initial struggles, the project was lifted along with all other boats as the digital revolution became established and progressed. I mention ISAS in the context of this project, Inks and Skins, because that was the time that the potential for science and manuscript studies to collaborate became crystallized, in my mind at least, and that the idea formed that as ISAS became established and embedded, and as the interests of science and codicology continue to converge, it might be possible to go further than the ordinary high-resolution digital image and to ask questions that would take us beneath the text. And that opportunity arose when I fled to UCC in 2012, and eventually began a tentative collaboration with my friend and colleague, Dr. Daniela Iacopino, senior researcher at the Tyndall National Institute, one of whose many interests is heritage science. Our exploration of materials and manuscripts in the special collections in UCC led to planning a more structured research project that would take us into the wider realm of the manuscript in late medieval Ireland, and then ultimately to a successful IRC application. And the questions we're asking are, as I said, are simple ones. What is the nature of the inks and pigments that were used in Gaelic manuscripts in the late medieval period, say from 1100 to 1600? Beneath the ink, what can science tell us about the material to which the ink was applied? And how can this information be combined with conventional codicological methods to give us a more complete picture of the machinery behind the transmission of Irish literature via the handmade book? As so much depends on gathering a critical mass of data, which we are still in the process of doing, all these questions still await absolutely definitive answers. But what we're achieving, I think, as in the case of ISAS before us, is to set down a clear protocol for the investigation, both in terms of technology and in terms of target manuscripts. In the latter, with the late 14th century Book of Ivanna as our anchor target, once we were well on our way with that work, we were able to branch out and look at other manuscripts and also to develop other, as you might call them, pillars of the project. Because I've always believed that it's the story of the Gaelic manuscript can't be properly or completely written or told until we investigate other forms of bookcraft that were taking place in Ireland in parallel with the creation of Gaelic manuscripts. And two in particular are of interest to us in the project. So far, the municipal tradition of keeping of records in the towns and cities such as they were in medieval Ireland, and the ecclesiastical tradition that produced devotional works, non-Gaelic devotional works and liturgical manuscripts. Both of those traditions produce books just like Gaelic manuscripts, except that they're not written in Gaelic script, they're in continental scripts, and for the most part are in Latin. But they still involve the placement of ink on parchment, and they were taking place exactly at the same time as some of our great books in the Gaelic tradition. So I've never believed that they existed separate and apart. So at the close of this presentation, I'll have an opportunity to thank our collaborators in the various repositories who accommodate us and in which we work. But now it's time to let some of the people who do the real work on the project explain what they do to you. Before this project got going, I have to say that physics and chemistry for me were sort of like a bad dream from my school days. But that dream has dissipated, but it'll still be obvious that a project like this couldn't proceed without science leading from the front. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce first speaker, one of my primary science partners, and that is Dr. Daniela Iacopino from Tyndall Institute.
Pádraig is becoming proficient in spectroscopy, I would say. I only have two slides actually, and then I'll give the floor to other people. So yeah, I'm a senior researcher in the Tyndall National Institute, which is part of UCC actually. This slide is just to give you an overview of the analytical techniques that we used to analyze the manuscripts. And the reason why we use so many is because when it comes to heritage objects, one size fits all is impossible. These are very complex objects. And also there is not one analytical techniques that would answer all the questions that these objects have.
And so we, more and more, we need multi-analytical approach to be able then to capture the elemental information, the molecular, and the molecular information, and the information that imaging techniques give us to build a complete picture, in this case, of the medieval book production. So the other issue that we had when we decided which techniques we were going to use, because there are many techniques, was the strict requirement for non-invasive analysis. So many analytical techniques require sampling, sometimes of micrograms, which seems very small, but it's actually a lot when we talk about precious objects like this. So all the analytical techniques that we used actually didn't cause any damage and were used without any sampling. So the University of Cambridge used this technique called proteomics, which allowed to identify the animals used in the production parchment. The Library of Congress used multispectral imaging for the analysis of parchment, inks, and pigments. And fourth, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy for the analysis of pigments. And then we in Tyndall use X-ray fluorescence and optical microscopy, again, for the analysis of parchment, inks, and pigments. I have one more slide in which I'm going to talk to you about the principles and how the proteomics analysis work. And then John will actually give you more details on how the sampling was made and the findings. So proteomics is a technique that allowed us to identify the animals that were used in the making of the parchment. And the way the sample, we collected protein sampling was by rubbing, as John will tell you in a minute, rubbing the manuscript very gently with a rubber, actually. So the sample we collected was actually rubber little samples. And the first thing when you do this kind of proteomic analysis, so there are 5 steps in proteomic analysis. The first thing that you need to do is separate your protein content from the rubber residues, which is called fractionizations. Once you have the proteins, you have to actually break the proteins further with a process that is called enzymatic digestion into their components, which are called peptides. And then once you have these peptides, you basically mix the peptides in a matrix and put them into a plate, like this, and you irradiate this plate with a laser. And what this does, the heat of the laser basically breaks the sample further, it ionizes the sample, and it also causes the sample to lift from the plate. And when the sample lifts from the plate and is collected in this detector, but what happens is that the way the sample breaks under the laser is actually specific to the peptide that we are analyzing. So, and also the little pieces of ions that fly into the detector, they have different weights, so they reach the detector at different times. And what comes out of the machine is something like this, in which these peaks represent this mass to charge, these little ions that basically fly into the detector. And by comparing the position of these peaks and the weight of these peaks with databases, we are able to actually identify the sample that we've analyzed. So that's it from me. As I said, John will talk more about proteomics in a minute, but I'll give the floor now to Fenella. Pádraig is going to introduce Fenella.
Yes, thanks very much, Daniela. We were very fortunate at the very inception of the project to make the acquaintance of Dr. Fenella France, who was chief of the preservation department in the Library of Congress. And they very willingly and generously became our partners in this project, and in particular with regard to the taking of or creation of multispectral images of our target book, Vivina, and other books that went along with it, and also last August, I think, doing the FORS analysis. Dr. Fenella is here with us today to explain what those processes involved and what the results were.
Good evening. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And firstly, I do want to thank the Royal Irish Academy for letting us take over the Moore Library for a week and a bit, and just doing some amazing work with spectral imaging. So one of the things, as Daniela mentioned, with heritage science, we're really trying to understand what's happening with the materiality of the material. And I do want to say, with all of you in the audience, it's the scholars who come up with the questions, and that's what helps the scientists actually do what we do. And that loop, that iterative process is what's really interesting. In case some of you are wondering about the accent, which is not American, I'm originally from New Zealand, so this is a deep Southern accent. So what we do with the spectral imaging is we start with the spectral analysis. It sort of maps what we're seeing on the surface of the object, and then we add some of the other point source analyses. So we have that mapping of the chemical, the response of all the materials, and then we add other analyses, and Veronica and Anna will talk through some of those as well. What I particularly love with the spectral imaging is I kind of want to say it's the new digitization. You know, everyone got into digital imaging and it gives you like a rendition of what the object looks like, but spectral imaging actually tells you what's happening below the surface. It gives you a lot of information that you can't just see visibly. And we can look at lost and obscured text, we can look at the provenance, we do a lot more identification, and also particularly I'm weirdly interested in the construction of like who the parchment, who scraped it, what they did. I know it's a bit weird, but I am. And so what we do when we do the multispectral imaging is we have LEDs, which are very low light, very low heat, and we start in the ultraviolet, go right through the visible and into the infrared. And so this gives us the response of those materials across a whole lot of different wavebands, and each material will respond differently to each of those wavebands, and that's the information that we're working with. From that, we get this stack of images, and if you look at these, you'll see things sort of appear and disappear as we go through, and that's the different response of those materials. And because we can do like a unique curve of each of those materials across all of those wavebands, that helps us identify what we're looking at. I do want to mention because we have a number of wavebands in the visible, a normal camera is red, green, and blue. We have 13 wavebands in the visible. It's kind of like a camera on steroids. So we can do a very high resolution color image, which is very good for facsimiles. We did have something at the library one day that was one of their original documents that was sitting on someone's desk, and someone came running out, they're like, why is the Declaration of Independence just lying there? We're like, it's just a copy. So we got pretty excited about that. But again, you can see here, some of these things start to appear and disappear. And this is really what's so important, as Pádraig said. We want to use the science in a way to answer questions non-invasively and tell us more about the objects. So what we have here is, on the left is a colour image of 48 recto, and then on the right, a false colour image. What we do is we actually process all of those wave bands, and we just say, assign a false colour, a random colour, to something that is different from something else. It might sound strange, but actually it really helps, because your eyes will see things that you don't see in the colour image. So you can see here that what we're trying to see is, are all the reds on the page the same? Because if they're not, then that's really helpful when Veronica comes along and does X-ray fluorescence, and she can actually know I need to test 3 places on this page, not just 1. So then again, what's interesting, you can see here again, we're starting to see some of the rubrication. It shows up in different colours, and the staining patterns are also interesting, and I'll come back to that a little bit further on. We get very interested in weird things like staining. I'm a little upset with some of the rare books at the Library of Congress, because they're very pristine, they're very pretty, and they don't have stains on them, which is really not interesting to scientists. We want, like, stains. Sorry, we do. What you're seeing here on the left is the heavily stained region. The beauty of what we can do with this imaging on the right is how we've processed what was under that stain to pull out the text. Now that's what makes all of you important, because, I'm sorry, I don't read Gaelic, I wish I did, but now we can actually read what was under there. You can read what's under there. So this is what makes this process, working together with scholars, incredibly important. The creation techniques that Anna will talk into, with some of the infrared, we can start to see the indentations and understand whether we're looking at something that's lined with a pencil, or whether it's actually something that's been scraped with a metal point. So again, these are just all of these things that we can get from just that one capture. If we process it different ways, we can bring out different information. As I said, I'm strangely fascinated by parchment creation techniques. So now we can start to see some of the veining along the bottom from the processing of the parchment itself. And sorry, it's a little bit hard to see there. And some scrapings along the bottom. You can see those better in this image here. And we've worked closely with some modern parchment makers, Jesse Meyer from Pergamaya, in terms of, like, what are they using to make those scrapings? Is it a moon blade? What is the process? So we can start to recreate those with modern materials, and then look to see, are they what we see historically, and what people were using to create these materials, these parchments and these manuscripts. Thankfully, Pádraig and colleagues have taught me a lot more about the manuscript than I knew originally, and so one of the things was the scribal markings, the pen test that is made before they start that particular section. And so what we can do with this false colour, we can see whether the inks are the same or not. And that was particularly interesting with these two ink tests, pen tests. So you can see here on the image on the left, both inks come up purple with the false colour. They are the same ink. However, when we look at this section here at the bottom, that pen test is a different colour to the ink of the text. So strangely, that pen test does not actually relate to the body of the text on this one, which is where I come back to you all and say, okay, we have a question. What's going on here? The dog's interested too. One of the things too that we can do with this false colour and trying to see how are the materials reacting is look to see, and this will, Veronica will talk more about this, but are we seeing generally the same type of ink? So what we've done here is we've pulled a selection of different pages, and then when we do the false colour IR, we're seeing sort of a reddish teal for the Iangor ink. So we're seeing a consistent type of material throughout the entire manuscript. The staining patterns are also interesting, because there's some suggestion that not all of the quires were together their entire lifetime. it might seem strange that we get very interested in staining patterns, but what we can see is that sometimes they are different front and back and different quires. That tells us that some of them, the pages were together and some were separate. So you can see here, particularly the recto and the verso, we're actually seeing a difference in terms of the response of some of those staining patterns, and that helps us understand what was together. So we're sort of trying to recreate the life of this manuscript from what we can glean from what we can see with these techniques today. I do want to mention reference samples. Pádraig noted, and Daniela, that we don't take samples if we can avoid it. But one of the challenges we have is that a lot of the materials are based on historic recipes. So one of my staff members, Cindy Conley-Ryan, actually recreates historic recipes, and actually all my staff love it. They all want to be in the lab playing. And so anything from marigold to ink skins to fustic, she goes out and actually grabs plants and tries to create, because historically a lot of our pigments did come from plants. So by recreating these recipes now, we can start to look at what that meant in terms of the historic. I will note that it takes a long time. So we have to crush the gall nuts, then they're processed differently. You will get a different colour whether you're using a vinegar or a wine, slightly different colours, and then of course the binder will give us a different colour as well. And from those we create these nice little cards of lots of different types of combinations to help us work backwards and understand what's happening in terms of the ink itself. This one I just wanted to note, we got really interested. Cindy went out and started, we were trying to understand whether, in terms of Ireland, were they using oak gall, were they using birch bark? So we went out and she patiently, or not so patiently, scraped birch bark, and it took her about 6 weeks to get a few mils. So we're kind of dedicated and weirdly fascinated with things, which is a good way to be, right? The reflectance spectroscopy is sort of adds the next level on to the spectral imaging that I was talking about. This way, because we have sort of a point every nanometer, we can get a much higher resolution for identifying pigments. So these are 2 folios where we literally, with the able assistance of my Pádraig, we were actually just shining a light. We capture the light into that fibre optic, and that gives us a spectrum. You're right, we can't just look at all of these and go, what do all the squiggly lines mean? So we have a lot of those reference materials that I mentioned that help us understand what we're looking at here. We happen to know here that this particular one, bless you, is because of the absorption there around 580, is potentially a Brazil wood that was known in medieval times as sapphire. So we're starting to work back, what do we find historically in some of these organic and plant-based materials to identify the pigments. And also the iron gall ink here, we can't totally identify it, but because of some of the different features in this way, one you're seeing in that little red black box to the left, because we get an increase around the 600, that's indicative of an iron gall ink. So a lot of these techniques, as Daniela said, and you'll hear from the other presentations, they all help us to confirm what we learn from one technique and guarantee that, yes, that's what we're looking at. I just want to, a little bit of a teaser. We have done a lot of other work, the stone missile, which is just gloriously beautiful, and just to show my weird fascination here, some fantastic scrapings here on the stone missile, and some other parchment techniques as well. So just a little bit of the background. There's a lot more work there. I look forward to talking with you further, but I want to make sure my colleagues have time to talk, and I will pass over to Pádraig.
Thank you. We have 2 PhD students working on the project with us. The first is Veronica Biolcati, who does the XRF work for us on all our manuscripts and also the microscopy. And Veronica is going to give an explanation of her work now.
Thank you. In this interdisciplinary team, I'm the person in charge of the scientific analysis, as Pádraig said, and I'm focusing on the use of the non-invasive technique X-ray fluorescence. It gives us the elemental composition of the material under study, and the instrument is portable. You can see us at the Royal Irish Academy in the left pictures, and every analysis is performed in situ. This is more video. Let me try to play this. There you go. It should work, yes. So to simplify the working principle, compare an atom to an onion with various layers surrounding the nucleus. Those are called electronic clouds. The X-rays emitted by the instrument impact the atom in the material, inducing the ejection of an electron from the inner shells, inner clouds close to the nucleus. Now the atoms want to go back to a stable form. Therefore, the void is filled by electrons from the outer shells. This transition emits photons of given energies, which are measured by the instrument. The XRF technique does not require to take samples, provides results in very short time, and sometimes might be the only techniques to answer a given question. So, how XRF data are used? Those are used for understanding more on the materials for manufacturing the manuscripts. For instance, the preparation of the parchment, the inorganic component used for making the writing inks, and for characterizing the pigments. So how do we do this? This detail is from the Liber Primus Kilkenensis at the Medieval Museum. It's dated around 1400. We select area of interest, so ink, pigment, and parchment, like in this example. Then we look at the outcomes. There are the outcomes, and this spectrum shows the 3 readings in a single graph. Then we look for the presence or absence of elements peaks that are ascribable to an historic material used for the manufacturing of those, such as in this case calcium, which is ascribable to the use of either slag lime, chalk, or gypsum. Iron, copper, and zinc, which in this case represent the inorganic component of an iron-based ink, alias vitriol. Vitriol occurs naturally. It is an hydrated iron salt and it often contains impurities such as copper, manganese, and zinc sulfates. Their presence or absence is generally used as an indicator of the ink. And finally, mercury, as in this case, highly suggestive of the red mineral cinnabar or its synthetic version vermilion, which was used for the lubrication in this case. Until the 19th century, no other mercury compounds are known to have been used as a pigment, so that the identification of mercury alone is sufficient to indicate the presence of the mercury-based red. But it is not always that easy. As we will see later on for green pigments, copper-based green pigments, at the time, medieval time, there were many copper-based greens, and the XRF analysis alone cannot be used to distinguish between those compounds. Hypotheses can occasionally be put forward based on a visual appearance of the paint layers, but only additional analysis by means of Raman spectroscopy or other molecular structural fingerprinting techniques can confirm the identity of the pigment. I will now focus on inks and pigments specifically, as my colleague Anna will talk about parchment. So our approach to the analysis of the inks of the Book of Ivana was to take readings from over 150 spots of ink across the manuscripts. It was done consistently across different font types: text, display text, capital letters, initial letter, marginal, and pen test. Based on our results, we were able to declare that all the inks are similar throughout the manuscript and are iron-based. In general, the presence of iron in medieval ink is accompanied by the presence of other elements, as I said before, including copper, zinc, manganese, representative of the vitriol. However, across Ivania, you can see maybe in the highlight, those elements were not found, or if found in very low amount. This phenomenon has also been found in other contemporary Gaelic manuscripts we have analyzed. an example of which is the astronomical treatise of the Marsh Library. If you look at the region of interest, highlighted in orange, both appear identical, and those are representative of the readings we have found on late medieval Gaelic manuscripts. So for this reason, we classify those as non-vitriolic iron-based ink. In contrast, the book from the municipal tradition, and here I'm showing the Great Parchment Book of Waterford and the Liber Primus Kilkenensis as examples, show higher intensities for sulfur, copper, and zinc. So we classify those inks as vitriolic iron-based inks. This one was done, as previously said, in order to compare the practices of various contemporary traditions. And it looked clear that the scribes of the Gaelic tradition had their own methods of ink production, which differs from that of other Irish traditions. Also, the elemental makeups of their inks points to the likelihood of a common recipe. Fenella already introduced this. It is an important matter, so we use the scientific outcomes on the Gaelic medieval inks to plan an ongoing side project. So our intern Cassandra reproduced the ink using locally sourced material. Ingredients included Irish oak galls or oak bark, gently collected by Pádraig, thank you. And we had their tannins extracted in our chemistry lab, and adding iron sulfates, which is the vitriol we were speaking about before, voila, the ink is ready-made. The video want to show you how quick is the formation of a metal complex, which is the chemical reaction happening between the iron salts from the vitriol and the tannins extracted from the galls or the bark. By making by our own ink, we can build a library of spectra, reference spectra, to compare with the outcome of real case studies. So if we go back to, going back to our target manuscripts, the red rubrication is the most commonly used and found on 55 folios in different hues and shades, from orange, dark red, purple. For this reason, we analyzed 62 spots with XREF to find a variation in their elemental composition. Our results indicated two possible types of red pigments: pure mercury-based, most likely vermilion. Said before, vermilion is a synthetic mercury sulfate, and a mixture of vermilion and lead-based pigments. This plot shows the red pigment distribution in codicological order, left to right, up to date. Notice that pure vermilion is found largely between quire 916 in the central part of the histogram, and is often found along with arsenic-based yellow. So you have to look at the green and yellow boxes in the histogram. The mixture of the red pigments are found randomly throughout the book, although pigments tend to be focused on opening and closing folios of the gatherings. This data suggests that the decoration was driven more by quire rather than scribe or folio. It's worth to say that the fading in color toward gray of the pigment mixture in the picture that you see on the left is likely due to the degradation of the lead-based component rather than vermilion, because you can see that vermilion stay orange, instead the other one actually faded in color, so it's possibly the other component fading. And it is also a very well-known aging process for lead-based pigment, which are aging under specific environmental conditions. When we are speaking about the yellow pigments, it is mainly used to decorate initials and capitals, but also is used to decorate the text in some cases. It is found on 26 folios, 16 of those fall in the gallery 10, produced by one of the name scribe Fenella. Every spot we analyze shows the presence of arsenic, which is the element associated with both orpiment and parallel agar. I'm not sure if this is the English pronunciation, but Italian. We found that yellow has a highly degraded, notice the bottom right image, where the yellow application is detached from the surpon and is also flaking off. Maybe you don't really see, but this area here is actually pretty loose in a sense. In many cases, visual traces of those yellow application are faded to the point that we confuse the mark left by the yellow application for either white or indentation left by a blunt tool. MSI, Fenella already shown this detail of folio 48 recto before, was very useful to highlight the location of those yellow applications and to visualize exactly where the yellow pigments were originally was. And we were also able to enhance and digitally reconstruct the presence of this pigment in those areas. Very useful for you, we hope. And there is only one place in the manuscripts in which green pigment can be found, is folio 11, 111 recto. And this intricate animal design has multiple pigments, including 2 visually different shades of greens. Despite those visual differences, both were found to be copper-based. And here I put for you a representative spectrum, which shows pink for copper and lead. At this time, as I said before, there were various copper-based pigments, including malachite, copper resinate, verdigris, which is a copper acetate, among others. And FORCE was the actual technique. FORCE is fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, which allowed for the identification of verdigris. That's how we use jointly the techniques. We always need to have at least 2, I would say. And finally, the presence of lead in the spectra suggests an intentional mixture with a lead-based white. I thank you very much for your attention, and I pass to the next speaker.
So I said at the beginning that the scientific process needs to be used in combination with conventional codicological processes and methodologies. And our next 2 speakers are going to address that aspect of the work. The first is our second PhD student, Anna Hoffmann from Long Island, and Anna is going to talk to us now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my work on the Inks and Skins project entails the study of scribal practice and materiality of late medieval Gaelic manuscripts through the physical examination of said manuscripts. So as already has been discussed, the Book of Ivania is both the target manuscript of our project and of my work. Through my work on Ivania, along with the other over 25 manuscripts we have already completed analysis on, I've developed a general protocol of examination, which is then tailored to the needs of each specific manuscript. This protocol encompasses all the physical features of any given manuscript, from the animal itself to modern-day conservation techniques. Through this careful and thorough categorization of each feature of any manuscript, we're able to understand more about how it was made, the practices of the people who made it, and the life it has gone through to arrive here to us today. So this protocol is divided into 4 different life stages of the manuscript, as I like to think of it. First, the production of the parchment itself, so including origin marks of the animal, marks made by the flayer, the parchmenter, holes, tears, etc. Next comes the preparation of the skin prior to writing, including features such as pricking marks and ruling. Following this is, of course, the writing itself, including the division of hands, the layout of the text, scribal notes, and I include decoration in this category as well. The 4th stage is any writing feature or features that occur post-writing. So stains, other physical damage, mold, the trimming of leaves, and any later reader's marks. In addition to these 4 stages are, of course, any outstanding features that we may have difficulty identifying and placing in their proper category. In this case, we would investigate further in collaboration with our partners to perform various scientific analyses like the ones you've been hearing about today, in order to hopefully identify a particular feature of the book. It's also true at any of these stages in the protocol that this is a collaborative effort between the sciences and the humanities. So I'm able to utilize the information we get from the multispectral images or the XRF, for example, to strengthen our understanding of the physical makeup of the book. Also, just to note that this protocol, as I've outlined it, is in a general format, but does not mean that every manuscript that we come across contains all of these features, nor is the list of features here exhaustive. So hence it's important to be cognizant of the unique history of each book and tailor the protocol accordingly. So the parchment itself is a pretty good example of the collaborative effort of our project and the use of various techniques to be able to draw conclusions about these materials. So features of the parchment making process are still present today, both visually and through scientific analysis. We're able to start by identifying features we know, such as scrape marks, follicles, animal hairs, and ruling type, and work our way into specifics through the use of scientific techniques. In the Book of Ivania, we took an XRF reading of parchment from every folio that we also took inks or pigments. Our findings showed a consistently high presence of chlorine and calcium, which you're able to see indicated on the first spectrum there on the left. The chlorine is possibly linked to the salt that was used as a preservative of the skin before it underwent the parchment making process. The calcium is likely due to the use of lime, which Veronica talked about already, used to remove the hair from the skin of the animal, or could also be chalk or gypsum in the preparation of the skin for writing, both of which contain calcium. In addition to XRF, proteomic analysis is carried out in collaboration with the Beast to Craft project at the University of Cambridge. This confirmed that the animal used for the parchment was indeed calf. This had always been suspected of Irish manuscripts, yet up until this project had never been confirmed through scientific analysis. They were also able to run a parchment quality index on the manuscript, which found that compared to their reference samples from the Orval Abbey Library in Belgium, the Book of Ivania is associated with a higher level of deamidation, which means that it was exposed to lime for a longer period of time during the dehairing process. Finally, returning to XRF, it can be very useful for us in helping to identify the exact type of ruling that is present. So there were a variety of methods used to do this, with ink, making an impression with a tool like an awl, dry point ruling, or with a lead pen. So XRF analysis of the ruling here showed the presence of lead, indicating that the scribe used a lead pin. But I'll be talking a bit more about the ruling practices in Ivania in a moment. So in conjunction, in addition to XRF, we also are able to utilize microscopy in our analysis of the manuscript. Microscopy aids us in the visual assessment of the book by providing detailed images at various scales, allowing us to both formulate a deeper understanding of the features we're able to see, but also to identify details we're unable to see with the naked eye. So here we have an example of one such case in the Book of Ivania on folio 50 recto. So on the left, you can see the general location on the folio, which will go in closer with microscopy. So by simply looking at the high-res image, or even in person, you would miss certain details that help explain the order of work of the scribe and to see the quality of the parchment inks and pigments. So we go to the first microscopic image here, just above the decorated initial X for Christ, halfway down the column A. Through this image alone, you can identify the presence of yellow and red pigments, and also how the pigment has degraded, which Veronica was talking about before. Additionally, you can see a flaw in the vellum right here, which is slightly raised and wouldn't take the ink. It gives the appearance that the first word on this line has been crossed out. The flaw actually appears to be a case of a collapsed vein, which occur a few times throughout the Book of Ivania, and also result in a similar appearance to what we see here. So we're able to go even further then with our next microscopic image. Here you can see that the text, it may be a little bit difficult to see with this lighting, but you can see that the text actually overlaps with the outline of the decorated initial. It's still quite difficult to say here, just based on the image alone, which was done first. However, based on our knowledge of how manuscripts were made, it's clearly more likely that the text was written first and the initial done after, especially considering that there is a guide letter X in the left margin, which you're unable to see actually through this image, but it is there. And then finally, we go one more time a bit closer. We're able to see the overlap between the yellow pigment here and then just the outline of the letter itself. And you can see the different textures between these two spots. Hopefully the lighting is not great. So these different textures could indicate the use of a different binder when making the ink and the pigment. You're also maybe able to see, kind of see here and here, little particles of yellow and red interspersed within the ink line itself. So this could be due to the scribe using the same quill for the inks and pigments, any droplets that occur while doing the work, and also a later abrasion of pigments between the folios. So microscopy, in addition to highlighting all these features for us, also aids us when selecting spots we want to use for the XRF analysis that Veronica was talking about. So thanks to William O'Sullivan's work on the Book of Ivania, we know of at least 10 different scribes that worked on the book and where they contributed. 2 of these scribes are named, Han C. Adam Kusin, who's the main scribe for the manuscript, and Han F. Fuelon Macháin Nishkel, who only wrote quire 10 of the manuscript. So that's who I'm kind of focusing in right here. My work on the book is then done on a quire by quire basis, but also isolated by each scribe. So this way I'm able to identify the specific features of each quire and each scribe, and then can compare them to one another. In the case of Hand F, these are some examples of features that I would be looking at. This would be pretty consistent throughout the entire manuscript and each scribe. So in Ivania, veins are broken into 2 categories, which Fenella actually already showed some images of, white or gray. White veins are kind of what you see most often and are generally more evenly dispersed across the folio. Gray veins can occur if there's still some blood left in the veins when the skin is being flayed and when the animal is being bled. So over time, this oxidizes into the gray color that we see. And I found through Ivania that these veins tend to be, they're quite common, but generally occur in the margins of the book, more likely where the axillae of the animal were. Other features to take note of are the number of columns per folio and how they're organized on the page. This comes in useful, especially when comparing writing practices between scribes, which again I'll be talking about in a moment. And finally, as another example, the marginal comments, which can be seen on each folio. So these have been broken up into type, so provatio pennae, scribal notes, intercolumnar notes, which happen most often in the genealogies, as you can see, especially occur in the female folia and quire 10 here, and later readers' notes. So here we have an example of comparative practices across different scribes within the same manuscript. So these are ruling practices between hand C and quire 9 and hand G1 and quire 4. So as you can see by the table, hand C generally uses graphic ruling, although there are 3 instances in the quire where he also uses dry point. In one instance, dry point and graphic ruling are found on the same folio. This could suggest 2 different people ruling the page and actually writing. It also points to the inconsistencies that can be found pretty generally across late medieval Irish manuscripts. In later quires by Hen C, for example, he more consistently uses dry point, so there's kind of a change. These practices change across the manuscript, again supporting that the idea that the individual who ruled the page may not have been the same as the scribe himself. So in comparison, hand G1 only uses graphic ruling. Visually, the color of this ruling changes slightly from folio to folio, from a gray to a more brown color. Rather than this being a different type of ruling, it's more likely due to the preparation of the support and how these lines appear on the page and fade over time. And you can see there's some instances where it's not found at all. That's more likely due to fading, not that it didn't exist. In a manuscript like Ivania, you wouldn't be able to necessarily identify a scribe based off their ruling practices alone, both because multiple scribes will use the same type of ruling, but also because there are many inconsistencies in their practices across the book. However, in some cases, it can be telling about the practices of that scribe. Hand G1, for instance, is writing mostly genealogies and is actually ruling each folio specifically for the number of columns that he's going to be using. Whereas in comparison, Hand F does write genealogies on a few folios, but still uses only a 2-column layout for that, despite the fact that he's using actually 8 columns of text. This makes sense in the context of the book, as hands G1 and G2, their purpose was for the genealogies, so greater attention was paid in their cases to that format, rather than hand F, who was writing mostly in prose. So these are just some images of the ruling lines seen in hand C and G1. So here, it's maybe kind of difficult to see, but you can see vertical dry point ruling lines, but then the horizontal graphic ruling lines here, again pointing to the fact that there may have been 2 people ruling the page. There's different practices happening there. And then it may be difficult to tell here, but it's even more evident in person that these lines appear to be 2 different colors, although it's more likely that they're the same thing. It's just due to the preparation of the parchments. So the same practice of comparing ruling practices can be applied to all of the manuscripts we've analyzed within Inks and Skins. To note, the ruling type here is what that's listed as what's most commonly found within that manuscript. So this is broken into the 4 traditions that we've kind of discussed previously: the Gaelic tradition, which of course is our main target, the municipal tradition, the ecclesiastic tradition, and then traditions external to Ireland, all happening around the same time. But it is important to note on this slide in particular that although the main time period of focus on the project is late medieval, we have analyzed manuscripts both much earlier and later than that time period. So this slide includes kind of a large time span of difference in some cases between the earliest and latest manuscripts that we've analyzed. However, as you can see, the tools and practices scribes were using were actually quite consistent throughout the centuries. So lead pen and dry point are the most common types of ruling found across all the traditions, of course with the exception of the ecclesiastic, which contains only ink ruling. But of course, this is based only on the 2 manuscripts that we've analyzed in this tradition so far, but we're still in the process of continuing this analysis and building up our data set. As you can see across the Gaelic tradition, lead pen and dry point are the most common and twice used within the same manuscript. So the selection of one ruling type over the other may have been based on whatever practice the scribe learned, what type of material was available to them, or if they were receiving their parchment leaves already ruled. So finally, another aspect of my work is measuring the thickness of the parchment across a manuscript. This is done using a micrometer, which I'm using here in this image, which I use to take a reading from each corner of the folio and then take the average of that for the folio thickness. This is done across any given manuscript, and then the average of all those measurements are taken to come up with the numbers that you see here. In general, there's not a large amount of difference between the parchment thickness, sort of speaking in terms of tenths of a millimeter. Although, as you can see, once again, in the Gaelic tradition, there's the most variation, simultaneously containing the thinnest and thickest manuscripts out of all those that I've measured so far. This variation can be accounted for in the different preparations of the skin and how the book has been used and aged over time. So I'm still in the process of collecting data not only from manuscripts in the Gaelic tradition, but from those parallel traditions as well. In particular, my next focus is on manuscripts from the same time period on the continent in order to compare manuscript making practices between mainland Europe and Ireland. And as with the rest of my work, this will be done in collaboration with our other team members and utilizing a combination of scientific techniques and physical examination to learn more about the late medieval Gaelic tradition.
Very much. So Daniela and Veronica, they will accommodate when they'll need no introduction. Our next speaker needs no introduction. We've been very fortunate in having John Gillis as a member of the team from the get-go. And John, as you know, Dr. John Gillis is a conservator in Trinity and star of stage and screen, with that and more. So John will talk to us now.
Everybody, it's great to be here, back again actually, as it happens. So I'm very much involved in the codicology, in the bones of the book, if you like, from start to finish. And of course, one of the major features of our medieval manuscripts, and particularly the manuscripts that we're focusing on within this project, is parchment, as we've seen here discussed now in quite some detail. So parchment basically consists of the flayed pelt of an animal. In fact, I might have been tempted to demonstrate with that dog outside. Will even be. So this is a cross-section of a flayed of the skin, of the pre-tanned skin or pre-prepared skin. From our point of view, as we look at it, this is what we're interested in. The process begins to remove both the upper layer, the epidermal, and the lower layer of the skin to produce this fibrous material. The important thing to remember here, although this skin can also be further processed to produce the covering material for our manuscripts, the leather that's been used, prepared, it's the same source. But when it's used to produce the parchment, it uses this fibrous material, which is the corium area of the skin. It's basically a protein. It's a triple helix protein. and we can see, we know how robust, how long-lived it can be, even under quite arduous conditions. Yeah, so now we have the science identifying our skins for us, and that's great, and it's wonderful. The only thing is, a lot of us have been found out when we made our visual identifications of what particular manuscripts were, whether they were parchment, whether they were calf skin or goat skin or sheepskin, and we would go, yes, that's definitely calf. But now the science, as I say, can find us out, and has done, myself included, I have to say. Prior to that, we would use visual identification. The best aid, usually and typically, to visual identification is the follicle. So on that papillary layer, at the very top of the dermal layer, are the hair holes, basically the hairs of the animal sat into. The pattern of these is a good indicator or a good starting point to identify what animal the skin came from. And we, as I say, we now have the science, we have the proteomics, which can definitively tell us what it is. Nevertheless, examining follicle is still very useful too. The size of follicle holes, how they're distributed on the folio, can give further information, age of the animal, area of the animal. All of this, again, assists. And you kind of build it up as a library in your own mind. The more of these manuscripts you look at, the more possible it is to make kind of definitive statements about the folio you're looking at. Yeah, so here's, nearly every skin we look at has issues, but this was normal process, and this was normal, typical to find, as Anna was talking about, the flay holes, diseases in the skin, effects of the preparation process, all can leave their marks. But as I say, it was considered the norm, it was considered something that was dealt with by the scribe, and he would simply write around it. It was expected to be seen. Of course, the larger the manuscript, and you take a book like Amania, the harder it is to avoid these flaws and flays in the animal, because you're taking up more and more of the skin. If we go down to a smaller book, something like the Book of Mulling, well, that's not in great condition, but Dimma, for example, where it's one of these pocket gospels, so you have a much smaller area, and it might suggest to you that it's a better quality product, but in fact, because it's a much smaller format, they can avoid a lot of these issues that the skin would have. Often these are associated with some sort of, as I say, warble fly or infestation in the skin while the animal is still alive. Generally, I think the majority actually are flay holes. It's a difficult thing, it's quite a skill to remove the pelt from the carcass of an animal. And the majority of them happen at that stage. They don't start out at this kind of format. It's only when they're stretched on the frame as they're drying out that they tend to enlarge. And the parchment maker, we'll all have seen the stitch holes as they kind of draw them together and kind of stabilize the skin to make sure as much of it is usable as possible. The scribes as well were familiar with coming across these issues, and they bemoaned the fact, that they were dealing with often, let's say, not the best quality of work. So they took to writing in the marginalia to complain about their working materials, and we see that found on the skin. So. It tells me also that they were aware of what a good product was. They were aware of the materials they were working with, and as I say, didn't hold back when they needed to complain about it. And they actually did it in the marginalia of the material they were complaining about, which I think is kind of curious. So here's a hot off the press. So the other thing. And the other aid, non-scientific aid, if you like, which helps greatly with identification, is transmitted light. And we talk about this now. Fenella was talking about the use of light. And here, in a very simple way, simply by transmitting light through the skins, certain identification is possible. And what you can see here are features that are expected from particular animals. So here and here are actually pelvis points of a calf skin. And if you see these ridges just visible here, these are neck rings. So by identifying these, by taking their measurements, where their location, what I've actually been able to do here is assemble 2 bifolia from the skin they were taken. So we can see exactly that was actually taken from the same skin of the animal. And you can combine that by also analysing, again, as Anna was talking about, scrape marks. If you see a scrape mark that then follows across from one into the other, it helps you build up a picture of how they put the choirs together, and of course, and the most basic question of how many animal skins did it require to make any particular book. So this is this isn't always possible. I have to say, this is current work. We hopefully will get this manuscript into the project. This is the Book of Leinster, which we just started extensive conservation on. It is possible to do this virtually. I'm actually able to do, because the Book of Leinster is a non-bound manuscript, it's in its individual choirs, I can physically assemble it. But you can also do this through imaging, through an imaging with transmitted light, and then bring the individual bifolia together. So back to Daniela's scientific explanation of our rubbings, the proteomics of the species identification. Just to run through what actually happens, as she says, it's a non-destructive. We use a plastic eraser to simply rub the surface. It's a tool we would have employed in conservation anyway, in a kind of pre-conservation stage where you would be cleaning the surface of the skin before you're carrying out any repairs. So the rubbings from that are gathered. Careful to avoid anything that might contaminate it. So I use a little brush to brush it onto a piece of filter paper, but you want to make sure the brush is synthetic. You don't want a hog hair, otherwise we're getting it analysed as pigskin when it's calf skin. So, and then of course it's put into the vial. We can add to this, depending on the quantity of the sample that's collected. We can up at one stage and get a full DNA analysis on the sample, and that can add things like the sex of the animal, the age of the animal, the health of the animal, and as they build up the library for these things, it can also tell us the possible location, and that's such an important piece of information because, of course, books are so mobile, so transferable, and so are the scribes that write them, so they're not necessarily in their hometown, if you like, when they're producing their books. So here's some just really, really early results from that, and you can see some sort of pattern developing there. But we will add to this greatly as we examine more and more manuscripts, and and build up and possibly come to some conclusions, or if not, at least generate some questions that require further research. But it's already interesting. It's a mantra of mine for years to go, well, the Irish medieval manuscripts are produced in calfskin, but that's, we're looking at them in an ecclesiastic monastic tradition. Outside of that, we find something else might be happening. So it will be really interesting to look into that in more detail. Other aspects of code ecology, of course, is the structure. With a handmade book, there have been conventions both kind of relating to time and place as how you put these choirs together. And understanding and accessing that help us, again, place the book in a particular location, in a place of production, depending on the style, the method used, the materials used, the gatherings, how they're put together. The creation of a book requires some sort of cohesive structure, and that cohesive structure will have a tradition to it, attached to it, depending on time and place, as I say. So what we do is we study these in great detail. We make models of them to better understand them, because often you've got to identify it without having full access to it. So you've got to identify sewings through bindings that are still in position. In addition, of course, to examining sewing structures and how the books, as I say, are assembled, as a kind of aside to that, we get a collation analysis. This is, in my mind, one of the most important tools from the point of view of understanding a book is how it was brought together. How many quires, how many bifolia in the gathering, how have they orientated the hair side and the flesh side. There are conventions to this, continental conventions, Gregory's rule, insular tradition, and our wonderful Irish tradition of not really giving a damn, just putting it together anyway. Which we see, it's almost, you can nail it down with that. So as I say, that's an aside and a very useful addition to studying the sewing. It helps us build up this collation map. And the collation map, as Pádraig was talking at the beginning, also from the point of view of often identifying where there are cancels, where there are lacking folia, collation analysis very much becomes a useful tool in that analysis when you can build it up. And of course, on the outside of all of this are the bindings. Yet again, our conventions located with time and place, and something that's kind of interested me over the decades is always to see how were we doing when, with the rest of Europe, being isolated on the kind of outskirts of Europe while it developed its sophisticated systems for binding books together. And I can tell you, we were doing quite well, thank you very much. You will find the Gothic tradition, you will find the Carolingian tradition, in this country at the same time, and in fact often even with refinements as we kind of figured out a better way to do things. So that's a useful useful tool from the point of view of seeing accessibility to materials, accessibility to the craftsmanship to produce the books. Did we have this? And as I say, further amendments. In the later tradition, in the later Irish manuscript tradition, in the mostly used paper manuscripts of 17th and 18th century, we start to see these scholars' bindings, where suddenly the access to materials and the access to the knowledge kind of drifts away, and they're kind of making stuff up. It becomes a really interesting study in itself from the materials around them without necessarily the expertise of the craftsmanship. But so again, a strong part of the codicology is the structure, of course, of how these parts are brought together and how they were protected, if at all, sometimes not. And that's great when you have this, and these are manuscripts from the project, and we're fortunate because they're all in their contemporary bindings. Not typically. This is usually what we're dealing with, and this is when the fun stops, really. So we've been talking about ammonia and how we've been able to analyse scrape marks, how we've been able to do the scientific analysis on the pigments. I've got to try to figure out what the original binding was of this in its modern rebound state, and that becomes a lot more difficult. So now you're looking for evidence of where we think back to the period, that Gothic binding system. Okay, what were the sewing layouts? What were the positioning of the cords? Can I see trace elements of where they might have been? Now, it's actually not so bad with this, because this was actually rebound by my old boss and mentor, Tony Keynes, and of course he had the mindset of recording. So I have access to that expertise, which is wonderful. But as I say, we have to bear in mind that it's not always as straightforward as that. So by understanding the structures as they stood, then you can look for the clues to what was originally there. As I say, if at all, sometimes it's stained skins. We often look at them to say, well, it was unprotected for a length of time, but there are a number of elements that can affect that. There is a theory, which I don't buy into, that Irish ink leached into parchment, and that's why so many of our skins are that dark colour with this insular term they use. Don't buy into that. But as I say, so often there's scant evidence left of what original structure might have been like. But the bringing together of science and humanities is advancing this greatly, and that's why it's so exciting to be a part of this project. Thank you very much.
so I can see you're still awake. It's great. I have one more slide only, just to say, yeah, as John said, this has been a great journey. I certainly have learned a lot as a scientist. Just to say, the majority of the talk focused on Ivania, but you've seen mentioned other manuscripts, and this is just a slide again to give you an idea of how many manuscripts were analyzed. The ones of the Gaelic traditions at the moment are the majority, because this was the focus of the project. But that now the interest is also into going to the municipal, ecclesiastic, and the English, the traditions. Again, to trying to find differences, similarities, and so on. And it's very much ongoing. We still have 1 year. It's interesting because the humanities came to us scientists with questions that we try to answer. And the answer now, I think we have more questions for the humanities. Like why, to me, is particularly interesting why there are vitriolic inks in the municipal and ecclesiastic tradition and non-vitriolic in the Gaelic tradition. Or we have mercury, arsenic, where these materials came from and why, why the use of one rather than another. So yeah, it's very much an ongoing process. It's fascinating, and I think Pádraig is going to tell us where we go from here.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'll just get you. Yeah. So I think it's fairly clear to everyone that of the variety of methodologies and processes that have been presented today, no single one can deliver all the answers, but that they complement each other, and in combination we're able to create a profile for any given manuscript that includes inks, pigments, and the substrate. Already the comparison with the parallel traditions, as we've been seeing in regard to the inks, is beginning to throw up interesting results, and the internal comparisons within manuscripts are also starting to be productive, particularly in our target manuscript of Laureate. And ancillary experiments such as ink making here and in Washington have given results which are of value in themselves, as well as feeding into the central project. So in addition to the three main pillars, as you can see, we're starting to look at also manuscripts that were produced outside of Ireland, England, and on the continent, and adding that comparative pillar to the process. Outside of the target manuscript, the XRF data alone and the triangulation process developed by our colleagues in Berlin has been of service in resolving research questions around the initial letters in the Book of Lismore, as was presented here at last year, November's to know. We've also successfully carried out ink analysis on annotations to an almanac printed in Dublin in 1666 at the request of the National Library. And away from books, we've done work at the request of scholars in archaeology and history on late medieval silver, particularly a processional cross and chalice. So with so much activity on so many different fronts, it's not surprising that we've generated a huge quantity of data. It's one of the characteristics, I suppose, of a fixed term technology-dependent project such as this, that more data may be generated than the project will be able to process, which means that there will remain enough material to be worked on at PhD level for a number of years after the project ends, and that's what we'd hope to do. With regard to the results, to displaying the results and making them available, complete interpretations, and everything we've got, we're developing at the moment a prototype using IIIF for a data visualization facility. In other words, such as you see here, this is 48 recto again, with the capacity for annotations and for displaying the various points on the page that we have analysed, and by clicking on that, within that box, bringing up all the graphs and the spectra, commentary, and in the case of this page, the actual transcription as well. And so this is what we hope. This is just being developed at the moment by a postdoc, Andrew Forsberg, and this is how we would hope to present the data that we've been collecting in an intelligible and usable format at the very end of the project. So it's a work in progress still, very much. And as Daniela was just saying, some questions are answered, but more questions are generated. And that's all to the good, because it gets us thinking in ways that we've never thunk before. None of this would be possible without the team that we've put together here. And none of it would be possible either without our collaborating libraries. And you'll notice the crossover in the libraries with the ISAS, and ISAS has been very helpful to us in that process also. And as with ISAS, we started work on this project in the library of the Royal Irish Academy, first with Siobhan Fitzpatrick, and that level of collaboration and understanding and interest has continued under the stewardship of Barbara McCormick, who's here today. So too with the National Library. Matthew Keynes and Elodie Levesque, now gone to the Sorbonne, was still part of the project. In Waterford, we thank Eamon McEnany and Rosemary Ryan of the Waterford Treasures Museums. And again, we're through this project, we were able to get the Great Duke of Waterford for ISAS. We're indebted to Dr. Susan Hood of the Representative Church Body Library, Grace Rees in the Kilkenny Medieval Mine Museum, and again, we're hoping to have the Liber Primus Kilkenniensis digitised for ISAS also. In Marshes, Dr. Jason McGilligan, Sue and Amy. And finally, our home library, special collections at UCC under Cronon, O'Divlin and Elaine Harrington. All of these libraries are part of the project, and we'll be adding more, please God, as we proceed through this year. And without them, we couldn't assemble something like this. So again, thanks to Ruedi and to Scoil Celtic for their very kind invitation to talk about our work to you today. We'd be happy if there are questions or comments. I suppose Ruedi would the Laura O'Frost will take. Dermina Mohammed.
Thank you all very much for the fascinating lecture, talk, exposition of what's going on, what can be done, and what remains to be done. I know it's getting late, but we have time for a few questions. I was going to ask one, what are the major developments in manuscript production between, let's say, the time of Pádraig and Ioana? Were there major, well, I think the lines, the dry point, and then to the lead, and then in the ecclesiastical league?
Well, I think from the Cáthach, you're seeing the manuscript at the very beginning, the Gaelic manuscript or the Irish manuscript at the very beginning. People talk about it being an illuminated. It's not an illuminated manuscript. It only has red in it, and very well drawn and geometric initial letters. But it's at the very beginning, and you see characteristics that you're going to see that John spoke about just a few minutes ago. We see the follicle patterns and repairs as well. Even though it's quite a small book, but it's quite basic at the very beginning. It's not that things get improved greatly by 1600 or by 1550. In between, of course, we have the magnificent gospel books and psalters, and then if you like, things they don't fall apart, they go in a different direction. I suppose the size of books increases enormously or greatly in that middle period between 600 copies and 1600 or the Butler Brewer. We have some seriously big manuscripts. But uniting them both at either end of the spectrum, we have the pocketbooks of the ecclesiastical, then with the pocketbooks that start to emerge in the paper era. The books get smaller again as the personal the personal books become important, and the books that can be carried around. With regard to the making of the books, there isn't an awful lot of progression. It's one of the, I suppose, the aspects that we see mirrored in the literary world is that the conservatism that people talk about is present at all times in the making of the books. But of course, it varies from book to book, and decoration becomes an important question in the late medieval period as to who did it, is it the scribe or is even twin. There are all those questions are still there, but there isn't. I wouldn't say there's any great revolutionary development anywhere along the line. There is a peak in the great books that we see at the end of the 14th century and through the 15th century, when patronage kicked in big time. The personal book remains stable all the time.
Thank you very much. Genjo.
I'm just wondering, do you see any evidence for reuse of leaves?
Yeah.
Somebody just said, "Oh, but
yeah." There aren't too many palimpsests. That is where the whole text is scraped away and text rewritten. We have a few. Laura Hill has some, but we do have a few examples of the recycling of older manuscripts put to the use of bindings, as happened all over Europe. But all in all, there is a great respect for the written word and a great respect for the book, for the manuscript. And it's a sort of a venerated object, not just that with the throughout there. But you do certainly, you do get recycling of materials.
Would you be able to read some of the older the stuff that was written before that?
We can if it survives. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we do that.
The use of multi-splatter imaging that could help in that side.
Are there any other? Well, I mean, yes, it's a Nicholas.
The project to carry on uses for paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you outline what they might be?
We can do pretty much what we're doing for development. For paper reviews, we can analyze the inks, we can analyze the paper. I'm very interested in paper making, and so we do all of that. And we have, in fact, as I mentioned, we did a paper book from the late 17th century for the National Library. We inked that, so that was very productive. So everything we're talking about is pretty much we can do for paper.
Well, we will have an opportunity in a few minutes. I'd like to invite you all for a glass of wine down below, and we can interrogate our poor speakers. Just one last notice before we thank them again for a wonderful display and a wonderful presentation. Our next lecture will take place on the 30th of this month, not here, but in the Benchers Room of the King's Inns. We're having a double event there. We're celebrating the cooperation between the ISOS project and the Library of King's Inns, which is now coming to an end. And Anne-Marie, my colleague, will speak a little bit about it there. It's gone over the years. And the occasion will be adorned, because we're in a legal setting, by a lecture from our colleague, Professor Fergus Kelly, on the status of women in early Irish law. Please book online, as they will. It's even more difficult to get. It will be even more difficult to get tickets for it than for the Vermeer exhibition in Amsterdam, which is impossible. And we look forward to seeing many of you there. There will be notices sent around in due course. But before we go downstairs, I'd just like to take the opportunity, we would all like to take the opportunity to thank Pádraig and the team for this wonderful, and wish them all the very best. And we look forward to learning more about the great work they're doing.